Welcome everyone to the fourth meeting of the 2022 edition of the seminar series on Sephardic Thought and Modernity, co-sponsored by the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University and the Bellsberg Program for Israel Studies at University of Calgary, and organized by Yuval Ivry and me, Angie Cohen. Our guest today is Dr. Vanessa Paloma Elbaz, and the title of her seminar is Rhizomic Networks of Unruptured Continuity from 16th century Italy to 21st century Casablanca: Music, Power, Mysticism, and Neo-Platonism. However, as it is customary in our seminar, we will remind participants of the argument of the last session, as there is a common thread between the different seminars of the series. In our last meeting, we had the opportunity to learn from Deborah Starr and Eyal Sagi-Bizawi, who shared with us an amazing dialogue about the representation of local Jews in Egyptian cinema. Through clips from different movies, they took us on a historical journey through the transformations in the representations of Egyptian Jews. They drew on a concept of nostalgia as critique of the present and capable of subverting nationalistic narratives of purity. We saw clips that presented Jews as both local and loyal to Egypt, in a past that could be described as Levantine, cosmopolitan, and tolerant, even if that past was not exactly void of conflict and ambivalence. The discussion added another angle to one of the themes that keep appearing in this year's seminar: the mutation of the Judo-Arabic historical reality into an oddity or an anecdote with limited impact on how we think about Jewish history. However, the number of researchers and the cultural stakeholders working on the reparation of different conceptualizations of the Levant and in Judo-Arabic culture as a cultural horizon, and on the transformation of canonized Jewish history should certainly give us all hope. Our seminar is a modest attempt to contribute to these trends of thought. As we have mentioned in the past, we conceive this seminar as a multi-layered dialogue whose purpose is to create a space of collaboration where we learn from each other and think with each other, creating an argument that embraces our different perspectives. Today, we continue weaving this collective argument with the company of Vanessa Paloma Elbaz. Dr. Elbaz is a research associate at the Faculty of Music of the University of Cambridge on the European Research Commission funded project, Past and Present Musical Encounters Across the Strait of Gibraltar, and a part-time Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellow at INALCO on her project Encoding, Absorption, and Abandonment of Cultural Material During Migration, the Case of Judo-Spanish Songbooks. Dr. Elbaz was Senior Fulbright Research Scholar as an independent scholar to Morocco in 2007-2008. Her PhD, which she received in 2018 from the Sorbonne Center for Middle Eastern and Mediterranean Studies at INALCO, was entitled Jewish Women's Songs from Northern Morocco, Core Role and Function of a Forgotten Repertoire, and was given with Félicitations du Jury. In 2014, she founded Joya, a Jewish Morocco sound archive, which recently launched its pilot portal at yalala.org.uk. We will share the link with you all. She has over 20 academic book chapters and journal articles on Jewish music on Morocco, Spain, and the Mediterranean basin, with a focus on women's voices. Her first monograph will be published by Brill in 2022, whose translated title is The Songs of Women of Northern Morocco, the Vital Role of a Forgotten Repertoire. She is co-editing a volume for the British Academy and Oxford University Press entitled Sonic Conversations in the Western Mediterranean, Music and Sound, Memory and Meaning, and a special issue of the journal Yod on Judo-Spanish songbooks as a technology of transmission. Dr. Elbaz has also been an international performer of Judo-Spanish and Sephardi repertoires since the early 2000s. Before getting started, just a reminder that the seminar will be structured as usual, 45 minutes of presentation and half an hour of Q&A. Professor Sabrina Perich will be moderating the chat, so you are all welcome to write your questions there. If someone wishes to open their microphone and ask their question, you're more than welcome to do so. Just make sure that you let the moderator know on the chat and wait for your turn. Dr. Vanessa Paloma Elbaz, the floor is yours. You're still muted. There you go.
Thank you very much. Yes, I will now share my screen. Thank you so very much for your very generous introduction, but also for the contextualization of the whole series, which I think is so important in our understanding how our debates and all the different pieces that we are trying to put together can actually weave into establishing a much richer and deeper and fuller understanding of Jewish history, culture, and experience. So I want to start with a quote from Bereshit, from Genesis, that says, Hakol kol Yaakov, ve'yadayim yadai Esav. The voice is the voice of Jacob, and the hands are the hands of Esau. It's from Bereshit, the Parshat Toldot, chapter 27, verse 22. Recent scholarship has begun to question the embodied manners of transmission that can capture memory. How can embodied memory in vocalizing, playing instruments, dance learning, and practice answer questions about transtemporal, translocal, and intertextual selves to exemplify the complexities embodied in individual beings? To understand this, it is crucial to combine the vast knowledge transmitted transgenerationally from tangible and intangible heritage of the whole Sephardi diaspora. Today, I will take a deep dive backwards in time from where my work has been situated in recent years. I have done this because of the realization that the populations that I work on are often carrying deep intellectual histories within their thought, behavior, and relationships to sound, being, and belief, consciously and subconsciously, but that permeate their ontologies of behavior. Many Sephardim throughout the world, be it in Istanbul, Tangier, Caracas, Argentina, Seattle, or Madrid, relate daily to the text from Al-Andalus as part of an unruptured chain of intellectual and spiritual transmission, and one where the voices, the kol of their poets, male and female, and rabbis, are voiced daily through their own voices through the cycle of prayer, study, liturgical poetry, and traditional songs, evoking the ritual repetitions that anthropologist Harvey Whitehouse claims function as linchpins for social cohesion since Neolithic times, while drawing from the concept that Halbwachs expounded on the commemorative meeting, which reenacts the past in order to not lose it with the passing of time. The rabbis are as alive to many Jews today as are the words of their parents and grandparents, and directly affect not only decisions and actions in the details of current life, but also the philosophy surrounding the lunar year of holidays and recurring celebrations. Women's fertility and women's position as the embodiment of the tree of life for the Jewish community as a whole, in a parallel manner to the Sefer Torah, ensuring fertility, continuity, and transmission, is part of the nonverbal assurance that is bequeathed to the next generation. The temporality of the words of the ancestors is immediate, and there is little perceived distance between the life and experience of the rabbis and the antiguas, the matriarchs of medieval Al-Andalus and a Moroccan Jew in Paris, Casablanca, Caracas, or Ashdod. Of course, this perception of an unruptured continuity creates avenues for insertion of attitudes and relationships to time, sounds, and being that might seem foreign to others who have accepted the idea of the non-negotiable rupture of the Enlightenment, but that makes perfect sense and works quite well within the construction of a neo-Al-Andalus in many contemporary Sephardi communities. The rupture and the recentering unto voice. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, the rabbis that codified the Mishnah Rabbah commented that the only power of the Jews was their voice, uplifted in prayer through song. By that juncture, the temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed not once but twice, by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BCE, and the second time by Titus in the year 70 of the Common Era. The latest empire they were under, the Romans, did not seem to be losing their power, as the rabbis actually had hoped until the 2nd century. At that moment, all of the oral history connected to liturgy, belief, and the Jewish legal system was codified into the Talmud and the Midrash in order to ensure its transmission. It was these rabbis that analyzed the line in the weekly portion about generations, called Toldot, which details the story of Jacob stealing the blessing from his brother, following his mother's directive. According to rabbinic genealogy, Jacob is the exclusive forefather of the Jews. Isaac and Rebekah, his parents, had twins who became two nations. Isaac's father, Abraham, also had two sons who had a familial rupture. According to rabbinic teaching, Jacob, who is known as Israel after he fought all night on the edge of the river with the angel of death, is the father of the Jews, and Esau, his twin brother, is the forefather of Rome and by proxy of Christianity. Which brings me back to the dictum on Jacob's voice and Esau's hands. The Romans, according to the rabbis, had the hands for war and infrastructure building, whereas the Jews of the 3rd century only had learning and prayers left as tools for influencing the world. This teaching was codified into Bereshit Rabbah, chapter 65, subsection 20, a book which had extensive circulation as a basic educational text throughout the Jewish world for centuries, and became the underpinning of metaphoric teaching of the foundational texts of the Torah. The concept of kol, or voice, became once again of seminal importance for the rabbis after another cataclysmic moment of destruction of community, tradition, and transmission, after the forced conversions of 1391, the fall of Granada, the expulsion of the Jews in 1492, which propelled a wide demographic shift of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula into Italy, North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, the Netherlands, and the Americas. Integrating the communal knowledge of Arabic, Hebrew, and Judeo-Spanish texts into the understandings behind the narratives that women and men were exhorted to sing and not speak, or that children had heard from female voices and read in rabbinic texts, shows that the production of voice and its listening was a choice context for the transportation between gendered sonic spaces. A voice that embodied the fertile lands of the community, the woman's body, and its relationship to seed, to agriculture, and to prayer. In contemporary philosophies, I find Mladen Dolar's 2006 writings useful for current contextual bases on the voice. He revives and develops Lacan's claim that the voice is one of the paramount embodiments of the psychoanalytic object. Apart from the two commonly understood uses of the voice as a vehicle of meaning and as a source of aesthetic admiration, the voice becomes an object that can be seen as a lever of thought. The elements which maintain transmission between language, locale, ritual, temporality, and belief employ various mechanisms to transmit different core information, particular to their own circumstances, geographical placement, position of subalternity, or hegemony. I'm interested in establishing over the longue durée how Sephardim employ multi-directional methods of transmissibility of their core cultural information in both Judeo-Spanish and Judeo-Arabic. The question that then must be asked is, how does the cultural self-identification of a group transmit itself over time when the group is exiled, dispersed, threatened, and changes its external markers of belonging? Using the Reconquista, the expulsion of the Jews, Inquisition, and Sephardi resettlement as examples, the idea is to track the musical aftermaths of the interconnected ruptures created around the events of 1492 for the Sephardi diaspora. The exploration of how nonverbal communal belonging is passed through generations, knowingly or unknowingly through music, can be demonstrated through examples from 15th century Iberia onwards. The music and its texts in question are already a hybrid form, attesting to deep and long-lasting cultural interaction and social mixing, signs of a diffuse cultural mélange rather than a powerful single entity. The music is transmitted in full view, yet beyond the perception of governing powers, and often through highly gendered means, signs and symptoms of divisions as much as of cohesiveness. What is more, while the music continues, albeit transformed, social groups claim an identity through music. Music becomes a sign of fictitious or imaginary community, despite the evident reality of a transformed performance tradition. The study of music then opens a new perspective on the complex interrelations of tangible and intangible heritage in the construction of a sense of community, despite migration and social change over time. A perspective that goes to the heart of what is meant by culture. Unbroken cultural transmission is an ongoing concern for migrating population groups who strive to ensure their continued existence. Studies on cultural evolution focus on arborescent models of transmission, with phylogenetic approaches to the movement of information. Looking at the post-Iberian 16th century as a seminal intellectual moment in the anxiety of formation of dispersed community, they created genealogies of transmission, family trees of sound and thought, which were transmitted through belief, texts, and melodies, genealogies shaped through formal arborescent hierarchical shapes, the tree or root, plot a point, fix an order. By contrast, a non-hierarchical and dispersed model, akin to a network rhizome, could have led to a loss of tradition in its atomization. A rhizome can be connected to anything other, not maintaining linear connections to the direct past. Because multiplicities are rhizomatic, they expose arborescent multiplicities for what they are. So soon after the expulsion, we see that a shape comes into Jewish philosophy, the shape of the Sepharotic tree, of the tree which is based on the Porphyrian tree, the image of the Porphyrian tree, which is interesting because if you look at Aristotle's categories, and it alludes to this tree trunk, and the Porphyrian structure reveals this idea of layered assembly of logic. So we have this idea of supreme genus and substance. So Porphyry himself never drew an illustration like this. His tree was purely textual in nature, but the symbolic tree of Porphyry was frequently represented in medieval and Renaissance works on logic and set the stage for theological and philosophical developments by scholars throughout the ages. And it was, as far as we know, the earliest metaphorical tree of knowledge. As you can see here, Yosef ben Abraham Gikatila's work Share Ora in 1516 is printed with this porteluchis, this Sepharotic tree, which looks almost exactly like the Porphyrian tree. And Yossi Chahes says that if the Porphyrian tree is visualized as an incremental drill down of ontological categories from the general to the specific, and the tree of Jesse and family trees more generally showed how an ancestral root could come to bear fruit, the Kabbalistic tree, governed by a ruthless dialectic of qualities, opposites, and synthesis, served as an inexhaustible, almost randomized recombiner of these qualities, opposites, and synthesis. The structure was understood to work as a kind of hydraulic system through which the divine abundance, the Shefa, flowed. Through the precise mechanism, though the precise mechanism was also a point of contention, differing visualizations of the procession aligned with the distinct structures. However, the anxiety of rhizomic dispersion from their original communities of transmission seems to have been countered with hierarchical organizing structures through male masters and disciples, paired with grassroots rhizomic structures of feminine transmission through the domestic sphere where governmental control had less reach. This double strategy of tree and rhizome within the Jewish community post-expulsion explains the multiple manners of sonic embedding of belief, ritual, and belonging in diaspora. Crucially, the gendered aspect of these transmissions has never been studied in a long-term and transnational manner. The strong presence of feminine musical transmission in Sephardi communities may be related to the minority status of the community. Jewish men's musical transmission is closely allied with the Muslim population's music, using the rhythmic and musical modes of the Muslim majority's classical repertoire, Arabo-Andalusian music, Islah, and in the Syrian case, we see it as well. They use the Syrian modes and the Turkish modes in the synagogue. maybe in order to align themselves with the majority culture's soundscape. Since in the Maghreb, most of the Morisco's population music was transmitted to the Maghreb, where they were the religious and political majority, the centers of transmission were and continue to be Sufi brotherhoods and public gatherings with mostly male participants. Synagogues play a similar role, functioning as hubs for the transmission of melodies, poetry, and belief, together with the gestural aspects that betray someone as belonging or not.
Vanessa, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Is there a way that you can move the zoom with the pictures to the top? So because we see like
yes.
a little black.
There you go. Is that better?
Sorry to interrupt
no, that's
you.
Perfectly fine. Yes.
There you go. That's a lot better. Yeah.
Great. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
I thought you could all see my screen and you could just move around the pictures however you wanted. So, okay, synagogues play a similar role. They function hierarchically and follow the arborescent model of phylogenetic patterns that follow genealogies of physical, intellectual, and spiritual lineages. Women's local repertoires function, though, as a nodal core of a large rhizomic structure of Sephardi diasporic transmission mechanisms. Through repeated performances of certain repertoires, music then becomes a refrain for demarcating the space around land, community, and self, primarily a communal self to recenter their own belief systems and cultural objects, sonic and other, as central hierarchies that establish their agency. The refrain of music demarcates the we that diasporic communities fight to establish and maintain by teaching and making music that is perceived as group specific. A sonic boundary is maintained, demarcating insider status. And the women's fertility, it represents both the fertility and the bounty of the land, as well as that of the Jewish couple in bringing forth new generations, which is very connected to the voice and to the singing of prayers and to the agriculture of the land, as we see in this chapter of Zra'im, of Mishnah, of the Mishnah Zra'im, which starts at the very top explaining the laws of prayer, even though it's actually an agricultural tractate. Today, political hierarchies deploy the Jew, along with other local minorities and their voice, as safe intermediate symbol of other, creating a discourse that is disconnected from individual experience, serving as a liminal point of connection between the majority and what continue being until today, self-contained communities in the post-expulsion diaspora. So this is an example of a group of baitanim, of liturgical poetry singers in Morocco that are very often deployed to represent Jewish continuity within Morocco, but for political spaces of power. And some, I think it was 2016 or 15, they also represented Morocco in Paris, here in Paris, at the Institut du Monde Arabe, to show the diversity of Moroccan culture. Crucial to our discussion is the fact that in Sephardi musical life, the gender of the performer often determines which repertoire is sung. Male singers perform ritual liturgical repertoire in Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Spanish, or Judeo-Amazigh, as well as popular secular Moroccan or Syrian, Arabic, Turkish, Greek, Amazigh, Spanish, and French repertoires. Women performers sing repertoires that are predominantly in Jewish languages, Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Amazigh, Haketiya, or Ladino, and rarely in Hebrew, or popular Spanish and French songs. Most women do not know or sing the liturgical repertoire, nor will they perform their internal repertoires in public. Thus, using Judeo-Spanish or Judeo-Arabic songs from the oral tradition in repetitive ritual utterance, Jewish women fulfill the role of guardians of the group's integrity through their voices that often sing about strictly controlled sexuality. Not only do women control against assimilation to the majority culture through sexual abstinence before marriage or strict fidelity after marriage, but they also resist the political project of the total homogenization of world Judaism, which has accelerated with the founding of the State of Israel. In the years leading up to and following the expulsion, the laws of pureza de sangre informed minorities, or blood purity, informed minorities' self-definition within Iberian society, making substantial portions of identity revolve around lineages, genealogies, and the use of race to mark the space around spirituality, political, and economic power. A counter-resistance invisible to the persecutors began in the way exiled Jewish and Muslim theorists in the 16th and 17th century perceived and wrote about music and its organizational relationship to lineages. Women's music and home-based ritual acted as a powerful subterfuge to ensure cultural and identity transmission during moments of religious and racial persecution. Music, then, as a privileged site of communication, especially for oral-based societies, became the inner point of inscription of cultural belonging, which was invisible to normative society at large. Oral texts, melodies, and rhythms sung in private gatherings or in the home could not be traced by the Inquisition, except through confession from a witness, and thus were only performed to loyal insiders, reiterating the emic inscription on the body. So in my analysis of all the repertoires which I have been able to collect in the Moroccan Jewish community since 2007, I have found that there are three large thematic thrusts. The first is liturgical, and those are dealing with issues of sanctification, either of the individual or of God or of the community. The second are romances or qasidas, right, which are narrative ballads that usually talk about issues of group boundaries and deal with issues of adultery or non-adultery. There are stories of temptation, stories of kidnapping, all sorts of issues like this, of the fear of the breaking of the boundary. And the third are songs of life cycle coplas, or songs for weddings. In Judeo-Arabic, there's a whole series of songs for the wedding, for the henna ceremony, and these are all about dealing with issues of fertility. So Jewish musical repertoire in the Mediterranean has been studied extensively by ethnomusicologists for the last 40 years, with many of the initial studies focused on gathering and saving traditional repertoires that had suffered a rupture in transmission from geographic displacement or political upheaval after World War II and the founding of the State of Israel. European philologists had also begun the process of gathering sung texts 2 to 3 generations earlier in the early 20th century, and in some instances, musical transcriptions were also taken. These, interestingly enough, were often military men, such as the Spanish officer Manuel Manriquez de Lara, who was in 1911 in the Oriental Mediterranean and in 1914 to 1916 in Morocco. And he did a collect of Judeo-Spanish songs in Morocco and the Ottoman Empire at the behest of Ramon Menéndez Pidal, the father of Spanish philology. Manriquez de Lara was a follower of German Romanticism and hoped to create a nationalist music from Spain, including the Sephardi materials as part of Spanish heritage. His first trip to Bosnia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Turkey, Asia Minor, and Egypt in 1911 and 12 was hoping to establish the contours of the Spanish romancero, into which he folded the Sephardi romancero, which was categorized with core texts and contaminations when the singers would collapse one narrative or one character into another. This viewpoint of pure and contaminated texts and melodies remains in the academic discourse until today. By the 1930s, recordings were made of Judeo-Spanish songs and conversations from Tangier by a student of Franz Boas at Columbia University, Zarita Naon, a woman from Tangier, and 7 romances were recorded at the Residencia de Señoritas in Madrid with 2 students from Tetuan for the Archivo de la Palabra in Spain. Quite interestingly, though, French musicology during the colonial period did not study Jewish repertoires, even though in the study of the Arabo-Andalusian repertoire, often the first or main informants the Europeans could garner were Jews, such as was the case of Jules Rouanet in Algeria with Edmond Yafil, and with Alexis Chotin in Morocco, who studied with one of the great rabbinic liturgical singers from Rabat. Most recently, historians such as Chris Silver and literary scholars such as Eric Calderwood and anthropologists such as Omar Boom or Jonathan Glasser have incorporated music and musicking into their societal analysis through traces of larger social diversities or unspoken trends within current national historiographies. Much of the scholarship, though, has focused on the safeguarding of endangered musical repertoires or the place of Jewish musicians in national political trends. However, Jewish Mediterranean society, similarly to the Sufis of the region, has been steeped in Jewish mystical teachings and practices through music for centuries. These underlying beliefs are core components of the relationship of Mediterranean Jews to music, and until now have not been included in the academic discussion. So I propose reframing Jewish Mediterranean ethnomusicology, or the study of its music, through the texts of Jewish mysticism beginning in the 15th century in Italy, Spain, and Palestine. The philosophical theories that underpin this larger community cement the practice and beliefs expanded through the Jewish canon, which soon after also influenced Jewish European musical practice, as well as its continuous interaction with Muslim philosophy and musical practice until the mid-20th century, and some believe until today. I think that at this stage in the scholarship, it is fundamental to reframe the study of Jewish music through indigenous metaphysical epistemologies, which circulated widely in the Mediterranean region. The Israeli ethnomusicologist Amnan Shiloha spent decades working on Arabic treatises of music. He himself was Argentinian of Syrian background and had moved back to Syria in the 1930s and later to Jerusalem in the 1940s. His command of both Arabic and Hebrew supported the study of these texts. However, on an article posted on the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Shiloha quotes the Arabic Ikhwan Asafa on music, but then compares it not to Mediterranean Hebrew music texts, but to Eastern European Hasidic teachings. He says the aphorism that music, which is primarily symbolic and universal, is a means of bringing men closer, is found in a famous Arab 10th century treatise, the Ikhwan Asafa. And today it's translated as the brethren of purity. It's different. Music, it states, has one special quality that language cannot render clearly or express through speech. This is why the soul expresses it in form of harmonious melodies. Strangely enough, this same concept appears much later in a Jewish saying cited by one of the spiritual leaders of the 18th century Hasidic movement. Silence is more than words, but song is worth more than silence. The Hasidic movement, which attributed great importance to song and dance as a mean of spiritual elevation, ascribed qualities to music which are similar to those described by the Ikhwan Asafa. Shiloha's choice of comparison could not have been for a lack of access to the texts of Sephardi philosophers, but more probably because of a long-standing political issue in Israeli perception of hierarchies in Jewish thought, often granting hegemonical status to Northern Europe over the Levant and North Africa's rabbinic teachings after the masters of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. His statement then, for me, exemplifies what Tuhiwai Smith's theory states from decolonizing methodologies. Knowledge and the power to define what counts as real knowledge lie at the epistemic core of colonialism. The challenge for researchers of decolonizing methodologies as a set of knowledge-related critical practices is to simultaneously work with colonial and indigenous concepts of knowledge, decentering one while centering the other. So the fact that a Syrian, Argentinian, Israeli, Jewish intellectual from the 20th century who died in 2014 is presented by the Foreign Ministry as comparing 9th century Arabic treatises on music, not with 12th century Jewish treatises written in Judeo-Arabic on music, but with 18th and 19th century Eastern European Hasidism, shows a rupture of the perception of unbroken philosophical transmission and refocuses to have the theoretical frame of the Israeli state. The incorporation of the centrality of the texts of Hebrew and Arabic philosophy into our ethnomusicological understanding of current communities also answers to the direction that our discipline is moving towards in recalibrating its relationship to historical musicology and to history, ensuring that the long-standing epistemologies of indigenous musical thought enter into our current analysis. The silence surrounding Jewish and Muslim mystical philosophy and current scholarship of the music of this region reveals that following European musicological scholarship in the region from the early 20th century, most of the studies continue in the tradition of an outward directionality of music, brushing quickly over texts on religious and mystical significance, which are of core importance for local communities. To decolonize then this scholarship and integration of the manner that musicians and audiences from the communities themselves interact with the region's epistemological relationship to music is needed. Crucially, the interaction and impact of these texts stem from the integral expression of self in the first instance, which only later appears in diplomacy, politics, and national identity. I propose a radical recentering using philosophical epistemologies from Al-Andalus and its immediate diaspora into the analytical framework of current analysis of Sephardi Mediterranean Jewish communities. I'm focusing especially on Sephardi mysticism because of its importance for Jewish performance and audiences until today. In addition to this, Sephardi intellectuals and philosophers have consistently engaged with Arabic philosophical writings for centuries, and both have engaged with Greek philosophy, Arabic musical theories, Jewish mystical writings on music and the senses, and the theoretical structuring of modes and musical impact through tree-like tables present elements of the multidimensionality operating within musical thought, creativity, and transmission in this region and its diasporas. The scope of this talk doesn't allow the fullest analysis that the breadth of this material needs, but forms part of a larger project that I am building on. So in the 12th century, Shlomo ibn Gvirol explored the three-dimensionality of Andalusian thought on the sensorial and the spiritual in a treatise called Kitab Islah al-Akhlaq, the improvement of the moral qualities, which uses the perfection of the senses to refine moral qualities in order to achieve a more perfected soul. He was the first philosopher to compose a treaty with Neoplatonic ideas, which were disseminating through Muslim Spain. And according to Martínez Lorca, a Spanish writer, he did it even before Muslim thinkers. Ibn Gvirol's visual division of the senses and their relationship is strikingly similar to a tree of Nubat in the Tubu in the Arabo-Andalusian musical mode diagram that is pictured a little bit further. It is, oh my gosh, I put it here. So you see there's Ibn Gvirol's square of the senses, and a 19th century musical manuscript that is now in Rabat has exactly the same shape, but it is a tree. It's called a tree of modes. I will come back to this later. Sorry, there was a, okay, so Ibn Gvirol's division of the senses and the relationship is strikingly similar to this tree of Nubat. This dramatic visual semiotic connection of Arabo-Andalusian musical structuring to Jewish mystical refinement of the senses and moral philosophy shows the shared intellectual structuring between Jews and Muslims who identify with Al-Andalus, and elements of intellectual structuring between Jews and Muslims, metaphysics and music that intermingle. Ibn Gvirol's treatise, originally written in Arabic, was translated into Hebrew and published in 16th century Italy. It formed part of the corpus of books which were traveling across to North Africa with the exiles from Spain. So, what does this have to do with music? Since the late 15th century, Jewish philosophical writers such as Isaac Arama, who was 1420 to 1492, Yohanan Alemanu, 1435, and died in the early 16th century, Shlomo Alkabetz, 1500 to 1576, and Moses Cordovero, 1522 to 1570, began writing about using the system of the Sefirot to magically and theurgically impact the world around them through music. Moshe Cordovero's Shiur Koma, the mystical shape of the Godhead, uses a metaphor of perfected song, similarly to a text in another book called the Musrei HaPhilosophim, the sayings of the philosophers, explaining that only when song is correct and perfected, such as the one that Creator taught, it can rise to the loftiest level. Song here refers to the actions of people who create a melody in creation through vibrational affinity. This is another one of the manners in which Jewish performers and producers in the 20th and 21st century may have inherited a firm grounding to the connection between spirituality, astronomy, and music, continuing the lengthy line of Jews who have been intimately involved with Arabic music and philosophy. Renaissance treatises on Hebrew on science, mysticism, and music have a very similar cosmology, connecting the calendar, the sun, the moon, the letters, planets, zodiac, and soul, together with music, often holding a central role. These manuscripts circulated from Renaissance Italy to North Africa through this publishing corridor. Ibn Birol is a household name for North African Jews. His liturgical poetry is sung until today for the Jewish New Year, for the month before it, for Selihot, and is celebrated in Spanish intellectual history since at least the 18th century. The Sefer Tikkun Amidot expounds that the refinement of the self is done through the senses. His stature of one of the greatest poets of the Hebrew Golden Age of Al-Andalus then leads to the question, did he gird his poetry, sung and heard, with ethics? The Kitab, this book, originally written in Judeo-Arabic, circulated widely amongst rabbis, singers, and students of Jewish philosophy until today, demonstrating that the unbroken relationship to the medieval Iberian Jew impacts sensory afterlives of Al-Andalus. This organization of spiritual work as perfection of moral qualities was a precursor to rabbinic ethical literature, which achieved its peak in 18th century Italy, such as Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, and further developed into the Sephardi vernacular with the Ladino publication of Shevet Musar in the Ottoman Empire, which still circulates among Judeo-Spanish speakers and sits in personal libraries, which I have seen in North Africa and elsewhere. Within Ibn Birol's system, each sense represents a cross-section of moral qualities. The book is divided into 5 parts, which you see here. If you start looking at, and on the left, sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. Each part has 4 chapters demonstrating the moral and ethical consequences of each refined or unrefined sense. Thus, sight, as the highest sense, begins with pride as its ultimate unrefinement, followed by its opposite, meekness. The third is modesty, and the fourth or second unrefined consequence of imperfect sight is impudence. I can't explain all the senses and their details today, according to this treatise, but want to focus on hearing, because if we're speaking about kol, about voice, then that impacts the sense of hearing, which he places as second only in importance to sight. Ibn Birol also states that people seem to be more influenced by what they hear than by what they see, and that it is key to refrain from listening to undecent sounds and to not be taken in by the beauty or pleasantness of a sound, but by its meaning and its intent. He divides the moral and ethical consequences of a refined or unrefined sense of hearing into love, hate, compassion, and cruelty. According to his moral scaffolding on sonic sensoria, the ear and sound direct the person straight into powerful and passionate aspects of emotional experience. In his introduction, he repeats portions from the Torah, which are well known to any learned or unlearned Jew, such as the central prayer in Judaism, Hear, O Israel, Shema Israel, proclaiming God's unity as a central tenet of belief. This is the sort of approach of three-dimensionality of thought that is seen in the Kitab, which uses the perfection of the senses to refine moral qualities in order to achieve a more perfected soul. This Neoplatonic thought seeps into musical theory and practice, as is demonstrated by the similarity between the visual diagram on the senses and their relationship to elements and a tree of musical modes of Tubu, pictured on the left, from a manuscript in possession by the Ragai family in Rabat. This dramatic visual semiotic connection of Arabo-Andalusian musical structuring to Jewish mystical refinement of the senses and moral philosophy confirms the shared intellectual structuring and pathways between philosophy and music. This is particularly striking because this treatise formed part of the corpus of books which were in this there were no Hebrew presses in Morocco until quite late. So because of this, the publications from Italy are basically flooded the Moroccan libraries until very recently, until the 20th century, basically. Gabidol's relationship to listening in relation to voicing and the emotions of love, hate, compassion, and cruelty is also bound to the separation of the Aristotelian sublunary cosmology into the four elements, then relating to the four humors, which seems to be a foreign enough concept to not appear relevant to our contemporary lives. However, as I analyze Moroccan Jewish repertoire, both men and women's repertoires fall neatly into time-bound categories that respond to the relationship between the lunar and the solar calendar. The organization of voice, listening, and cosmic cycles is seen starkly in women's repertoires and connected to their own menstrual and fertile cycles, which were called the moons in Jewish vernacular. It should then come as no surprise that quotidian repertoires are preponderantly connected to solar cycles, while ritual and paraliturgical repertoires are preponderantly connected to the lunar cycle and holidays. The Aristotelian idea of the cosmos divided into layers in which the divine should reach into the lower realms in an uninterrupted manner, as is described in pseudo-Aristotle's De Mundo, is embodied for Moroccan Jews through the voice, their repertoires, and the lunar or solar cycle in which the repertoire is inscribed. Since Ibn Gvidol's poetry is sung until today in synagogues and concert halls, inscribing his philosophical line deeply into the liturgical and emotional sensorial experiences of Jewish communities throughout the world, his study of the sense of hearing and its connection to sound and music inscribe the teaching of his texts into the lived experience of singers, rabbis, and audiences. The sonic aesthetics of Jewish medieval Al-Andalus continue to be found in the mystical approach to song and listening as deployed for devotional practice in Jewish communities who feel connected to these philosophical threads until today. Isaac Arama was born in Spain and died in Naples in 1494, 2 years after the expulsion. His book, Akidatishak, was studied at the yeshiva in Tetuan in Morocco in the mid-20th century. In fact, only in November, the chief rabbi of Morocco's rabbinical tribunal confided in me that he had the first edition from Venice in his yeshiva in Tetuan when he was an adolescent. In this book, the author explores the interdependence of music to the movement of humans and the music of the spheres. A subsection of his book, Akidatishak, is called The Song of the World, Nigun Haolam, and states in a typical Neo-Platonic way that one can conceive of the universe as an orchestra in which each instrument plays its assigned part. Should an instrument fail consistently, the disharmony created will disable the entire orchestra. Perhaps the comment by our sages about David's harp starting to play all by itself may be understood simply. When man does his share, the entire orchestra comes alive and worships its maker. On the one hand, nature is supposed to provide the planet's sustenance. On the other hand, man distributing nature's bounty in a fair and equitable manner complements the nature's work and completes the task of performing the will of the Creator. There are numerous verses in Scripture supporting this thesis of the interaction of the laws of nature and human behavior. So we go back to the tree, to the Sepharotic tree, and we see that at the very top of the Sepharotic tree, we have Keter, which is the crown, and is at the very top of the emanations of the world of creation. And at the very bottom, we have the mouth, which is Malchut, which is kingship, and which is the world of action, and which represents power as well. It also connects to the four elements in the similar way as the Neo-Platonic division of the elements and the Arabic musical theory and Ibn Gvidol's theories as well on the senses. And so here you can see the Porphyrian-like Sepharotic tree showing us that we arrive from above consciousness to the Sephira of action, and having music at the top with power at the bottom at the moment of action. And so it shows us that we have these punctuation of space and time that enacts the relationship of power. And these punctuations are often in moments as in relation to the palace, where we have Jewish musicians performing at the palace in Morocco, in relations to Jewish festivities, in relations to diplomats, as I showed you on an earlier slide, in relation to civil society, and as well in relation to the Jewish diaspora. Of course, this has is even further informed with the recent Abraham Accords and the power that music and the performativity of music has in that political relationship in contemporary Morocco. So we have here a couple of images for me to show you this. These are two Jewish singers from the beginning of the 20th century. This is King Mohammed V, and it was actually the celebration of the birth of King Hassan II in Rabat. And they had requested that this singer, Baishan, come to sing for the birth. So this punctuation of the Jewish voice in the heart of the seat of power and in the heart of the transmission into the next royal line, the next person in the royal lineage. But then we have somebody like Salim Halali, right, who was a very famous Judeo-Arabic singer, who had a cabaret, who was a gay man as well, and who was protected in the Mosque of Paris, just actually up the street from where I'm staying, during the war. And he played this intermediate position where here, this is a photo that is not available publicly. But here he has Herzl behind him and the flag of Israel, singing in the club of the Allianz in Casablanca. But he's considered to be a great star and a great friend of the Arabic public-facing non-Zionist existence of Jews in Morocco. However, this is part of his own private sphere. So we see how that works. And this is a most recent event that happened only last week, actually, in Rabat, or was it in Casablanca? I believe it was in Rabat, but it was a concert with the Israeli Andalusian Orchestra from Ashdod and Mohammed briewell, who's at the very top in the red fez, who's considered to be one of the most important musicians of Andalusian music in Morocco, and Abdelrahim Swidi, the singer to his left, who had a milk mother, as they call it in Morocco. He was, his neighbor was a Jewish woman, and he suckled from the breast of a Jewish woman as a baby. And so today, some people consider that he actually sings with a Jewish flair because he had that kind of imbuing through the milk of the mother, which I think is, I mean, we'll talk about this on another occasion, but there's a very interesting issue about that. So to conclude, I want to propose that there's an importance in taking a longitudinal view of the communities whose case studies we study, understanding the often unspoken and non-verbalized aspects of core cultural understanding through music, which are more often than not in these communities intrinsically bound with ritual, belief, and intimate moments of transmission through sound, gesture, and thought. These philosophies can, and I dare even say should, form the theoretical grounding on which we understand the interconnectivity of these communities with the past philosophies in which they ground themselves, as its intellectual scaffolding offers the sort of ontological structuring of thought that is intrinsic to the material itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vanessa. This was fascinating. I just shared with everybody the link to the archive in case they want to have a look at it. And it's already so rich. It's a beautiful, beautiful project. So, well, thank you so much. First, I want to ask if there are any questions in the chat, or we should.
Or if you would like to ask a question using your voice appropriately, please just either raise your hand or either through Zoom or your hand in your video screen. Yeah, and we'll start off with Yaron.
Hello, thank you very much, Vanessa, and good to see all of you. Two quick questions. One is really just like something I found interesting. It's not even really a question. Toward the end, the picture with Herzl and the flag of Israel, it's kind of interesting. It says 1950. And so my first question, isn't it only 2 years earlier that Allianz was considered non-Zionist or anti-Zionist, whatever we want to say? I think it's 1948 that they changed their stand. The main question I have is you started with a call, voice, yeah? Now, it's interesting that Hebrew has the word call, which can be translated as sound and voice. And at least the dialects in Arabic that I am familiar with, I don't remember if in the Fusha, there's also a distinction between sound and voice. Is it something that, because you used both words, and I don't know if it's important for you to make the distinction between the two?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much so first I'll talk, the whole Allianz conversation is much longer. I'm actually very close to the Harus family, who was the head of the Allianz during that time period. And it's interesting because officially the Allianz had to be non-Zionist, but practically it actually wasn't. It was very pro-Israel. And a lot of the people and Moroccan Jews today even say that the Allianz kind of prepared the Moroccan Jewish Aliyah, really, that it prepared a lot of with the agricultural school that they had in Marrakesh and the learning of different languages and all these different issues. So, but what is allowed to say officially and what really happens are often different, which I think is actually very interesting. And that's what today we can start to look at these complexities. And because, yeah, Salim Halali this picture is quite fascinating because he would have never, ever said he wouldn't have had the kind of clientele that he had at the Coq d'Or. That was like a huge place. It was a small place, but it was a very, very important center of music and culture in the Medina if people had said that he was Zionist. So if this picture had gone out, into the Arab press, that would have been bad for him. On the issue of the word for kol, so it's interesting because, and this is something, thank you for making that point, because it's something that I'm thinking about and that I need to, I actually want to write some of this for sound studies. And in sound studies, there's the whole issue of what is sound and what is voice, and it's not the same, right? Because sound is also, there's this whole section of the scholarship that's talking also about what people consider to be noise, and that often the music of the other is considered to be noise and isn't considered to be voice, for example, or that voices, even if you read the 19th century travelogues of the people coming and hearing the music of North Africa, they say it was strident, it was horrible, how can anybody ever listen to any? So there's this issue of noise, of sound, of voice that I think would be very important to parse out. And so thank you very, very much for putting that. Thank you.
I wanted to share with you something that I was thinking while I was looking at this map of the Sefirot and how about the method that you've used. I kept thinking about something that Amir Al-Khalai mentioned in his talk about how it was actually he was quoting someone else's idea, but the problem of having biology as our model instead of electromagnetism. That seems to work a lot better as not only as a metaphor but as a model to see how there's points of energy that connect with each other, not only throughout time but throughout space. They mutate, and so I thought that the whole lecture. I mean, I know that's the idea of the rhizome, but the rhizome is still committed to the idea of the tree in one way or the other. Now, in the sense that it's it's an alternative to the idea of the tree, but I kept thinking about this like electromagnetic model as so useful also for all of this connections, and but also the continuity of a lot of this phenomena, and the continuity of a lot of these concepts, the transformation, but the continuity also. And I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah. So when Alcalá said that back whenever that was in, I can't even remember, January.
It doesn't matter. Yeah, it was in January. Yeah.
I was like, oh my gosh, this is the rhizome and the tree. I was so excited to hear. And I actually wrote to him later and I was like, because the thing that I think is so interesting is that we're kind of stuck, as he said, in these biological, genetic, kind of hierarchical, and what's the lineage, kind of the idea of lineage, right, which comes from this German 19th century way of structuring thought and structuring. I mean, musicology is actually based on that as well, which means and which has also racist underpinnings, right? So it's this idea of hierarchies then put like a jail cell. It just encloses you in a manner that there's no possibility or potential for the cracks, the openings of the unusual to happen. And as we know, I mean, life is full of the unusual. And so how do we explain for that, right? You can't just cut everything that is in the unusual out and say, well, it doesn't matter because it's not in the hierarchy, right? Only the things that are on paper and that are in the hierarchy are what are going to count and are what are important. I mean, that's not the world. That's not what's actually happening. So this is why I find this idea of the rhizome, which when he said electromagnetism, for me, it symbolized this idea of this dispersal. It can also be thought of, I mean, I was thinking about the tree root networks also that seem to be those networks that interconnect beyond the trunk, right? So we actually see only this hierarchical issue, but actually what's happening is a lot more complex and interconnected. And the idea is then to see, and what it appears to me and what I'm proposing is to say the Jews, when they left Spain, did both. They used the hierarchical thing to keep some kind of semblance of organization in this dispersion, but at the same time, they used the rhizomic interconnected web to maintain the fullness and to allow for openness, for creativity, for transformation in different ways. Because what happens is that I didn't get into the details of this, but what happens is that a lot of, for example, so there's songs that were taken from, or texts, right, that are taken from pre-expulsion Iberia to the Sephardi diaspora. And they're still sung in one form or another, or they're pieces that are sung, but they're their use is not related to Spain necessarily. It's related to what they needed this song to function for their own inner communities at the point where they were living and when they were living. And so in that manner, it gets repurposed and integrated, and it becomes part of this core identity repertoire that then becomes Jewish repertoire. But then the Spanish see it, in the 20th century, in the 19th century, and they say, oh, this is Spanish repertoire. But for the Jews, it's Jewish repertoire. It's not Spanish repertoire. So this is, but it's because of this process, this rhizomic process of integrating the material that is necessary for this maintenance within a wide network that is not hierarchical.
Yuval.
Yeah, Vanessa, really, thank you very much. It was fascinating lecture. I have so many things that to discuss with you, but I think that for me, the most, the striking thing that for me, most interesting was the concept of rupture. Of course, the rhizome and the reaction to the rupture, but the rupture in the 15th century. And another rupture that I am more connected or dealing with in my research is the rupture that happened in the 19th century and then in 1948 of the emergence of nationality, the conflict, the displacement of most of the Jews from the Arab land, the disconnection, discontinuity and rupture from Arabic culture, and in that sense, some of these figures that I'm working on, when they experience this rupture, they're going back to Al-Andalus. So they're going back to this kind of the first rupture and to see that this kind of how they reacted and trying to learn how to react now in our rupture. This is one thing. So I'm interested because you definitely already, I'm sure that you are working on this kind of connection. You mentioned it in your lecture as well. The second thing is the power of music, as you showed, because in the case of the most of the Arab Jews, Mizrahi Jews that arrived to Israel, most of them in the second generation already forgot the Arabic as a language, but somebody said when they erased the Arabic language, they forgot to close the synagogue's door. And inside the synagogue, the Arabic music, the liturgic, stayed. So in many ways, and now we see a third generation of return, like Zev Yecheskel and Netal Kayam returning to Arabic, physically through music. So in many ways, music is the vehicle to the container to leave the traces that were forgotten.
Yes. So, gosh, there's so much good stuff there that I'm like, what do I respond to?
Wait, can I just add one thing to what you guys, so you can answer to the both of us? So, and not only the music, but also what they couldn't get rid of was the pronunciation of each of the communities. How the liturgical pronunciation of Hebrew, that is something that no matter how much you want to erase that, when you go and learn to prepare for the bar mitzvah with your rabbi or with whoever it is that is going to train you, I mean, we all know of a lot of cases in which you were taught an Ashkenazi pronunciation, but in many other cases, you go to a Yemenite synagogue, and what they learn is the Yemenite pronunciation. In Moroccan synagogues, you learn the Moroccan pronunciation, and so on. So that's also something that stays there as as this ghost.
I think it's a sonic marker.
A sonic marker. Okay.
Yeah. So there's this issue of what can you erase, right? When the forces of politics and government kind of plop on top of the community, what can those forces do? And what can these other rhizomic, right, underground resistances do, which are actually more powerful than the state is? Because, they can take away the language, right? They don't have Arabic anymore. But that sense of this deep value and core curiosity to something lost and something intrinsically connected to themselves and their own ancestors, right? So here we go back to the tree, the ancestral bit, but that is, it reawakens. No matter how long. I mean, it sometimes we see it with, I think with the crypto-Jewish phenomenon, we see it's generations. It can be 6, 7 generations, and there are people, I mean, it's not every single descendant, but there are many that there's something that's reawakened that is calling them. So this is what I'm interested in, is what is this? How is it that non-verbally we are transmitting these cultural information? So it's not, it can be, so we all have the same texts of the Torah, for example, right? We're all studying the same Mishnah, and we're all studying the same Talmud, and we're all reading the same Parshas. And so there's this kind of world Judaism that's kind of, that's homogenized, that's been canonized and homogenized. But within that, the sonic is the aspect that is particular. And so the melodies are different, the damim are different, the accent, this, you say the ha and you don't, that these, and there are people that actually try to relearn how to say the ha, because they want to actually then have this performativity of their own inner belonging. And the performativity is done through the voice of the liturgical, but also then of the secular materials. First, it might start through the ear, right? And then we have the generation now of all these performers that are starting to perform and to go back and which, you know, it's, I've seen it from the other side, like being in Morocco. I was there when Neta and Amit went for the first time. And, you know, the Moroccan Muslims were like, wow, this is amazing. Like they couldn't believe it, that there were Israelis, young Israelis, that still knew Moroccan Arabic. So these are all elements that I think are important for us to think about as manners of the non-rupture, because the ruptures can feel very dry, I would say, like sec, as they say in French, you know, like they cut, they're very clean, but actually they're not clean, and they're not complete. And there are these threads that sometimes are almost completely erased, but then slowly, somehow, some of them can reawaken. And in part, it's because of the memories that have been passed down of these various experiences of lived connections. So be it to Iraq or to Morocco or to Egypt or to Al-Andalus, you know, the big epic one is, I'm going to reconnect to Al-Andalus, right? That's the epic reconnection, because that's the source of it all, it seems, right? It seems like and because there's so much great poetry, but I also think that it has to do with the fact that it's a source also for the Arabic world, and it's a source also for a lot of the philosophies in the Christian world, because there was all this translation from Greek philosophy that was going through Al-Andalus. So there's an influx of Greek philosophy into the Western world, or into the European world, through Al-Andalus. And it also comes into so in the book, that I didn't have time to talk about this today, but the book that Ibn Virol wrote was published in 1562 in Riva de Trento, right? So this is where the Council of Trent was happening. And they actually only published like 30 Hebrew books for a very short time. And and they stopped printing in 1562. And this pamphlet had 3 little books in it. The first one was Ibn Virol's book on the senses, on the midot, the refinement of the character traits through the senses. The second is one called Mustria Philosophim, which is a translation of a 9th century Nestorian's book from Baghdad on the translation of the Greek philosophers. And it has 2 chapters on music, which are in the Hebrew translation, but which did not make it into the Spanish translation of the same book in the 15th century. So I'm kind of working on that translation of those chapters and trying to analyze and see what happened there and why. And then the third book in that little pamphlet is one called Sefer HaTapuach, the Book of the Apple by Aristotle. So here we have this text that kind of encapsulates what was going on during this period and the kind of concerns that people were having and how they were so concerned. We have Isaac Arama that was also writing this concern with the voice and with music and with changing and impacting creation. How do we impact creation when our world has been destroyed, when we have no power? What is our power? Hakol Yaakov. Our power is our voice. That's it. And so we will sing. And this is, I think that we hadn't really talked about this yet.
So one of the general functions of memory is to transport from one generation to the other what is deemed to have patrimonial value. So, and this is not necessarily something that happens in a conscious way. It's not that you necessarily only remember or make a conscious effort, but it's a general function of a preservation for the sake of the next generation, because whatever it is that you're carrying is good or has the next generation might need it. So there is then the awareness of the patrimonial value of your life, of your knowledge, of the world you knew. So it's not, I think that this is a very, the question of the function of memory as transporting from one generation to the other, I think is very important. Is very important here.
Yeah, and I think that the thing is that we always think about memory primarily as the memory of things that we carry in our intellect.
Exactly.
However, memory is also the things that we carry in our subconscious and in 100%. Our bodies, right? And so there's all this all sorts of new writing, and the thing is that it's a lot more untraceable. Like, how do we trace that, right? So for the scholar,
also the practices that people do in order to preserve, to be connected to the world they came from, don't have to do with memorization practices on an intellectual level. They have to do with a very with much more subtle repetitions of habits, of ways of speaking, of sharing stories that everybody already knows, singing singing certain songs, eating certain foods. For sure, it has nothing to do with the not nothing, but it's not necessarily connected to the intellectual world.
Yeah, the harder memories to cut completely are the ones that are more physical.
Yeah.
So because you can cut somebody off from their intellectual memory, for example, to the language, but their desire to smell that they would smell in their grandmother's kitchen, or that, and the memory that the
sounds of the synagogue,
the sound, Yeah, the sound of
Yeah.
the singing voice, the melody that they used to hear on the radio that their parent was listening, you know, those kinds of memories are triggers. However, there's, I mentioned his work at the very beginning. There's an anthropologist called Harvey Whitehouse, who has just published recently a book called The Ritual Animal, which I find very useful because he's talking about the different kinds of kind of encoding of cultural memory and of creation of groups. And so he says, you know, we have these repetitive, cyclical, ritual type activities that we do. And a ritual doesn't need to mean Passover, for example,
No,
right?
for sure.
But it can mean, I don't know, you always
Its purpose is
take
to
a
be
walk.
repeated,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
like
And-
like telling stories in the family, telling stories that everybody knows, and the
or a
purpose is
certain
not
kind of
to
humor, for example, a certain kind of humor.
exactly.
So this is something that I found that today, a lot of the songs have been forgotten, but the topics of the songs are still used in jokes. So they're not singing the song, but they're telling the jokes that are telling the same story. So they're passing that same kernel of information to the next generation, because the next generation will have that kernel embedded and will then either pass on the joke or maybe relearn the song or transform it into something else. But it will still be there in some form. And so this is what I think is interesting for us to trace, because we're so concerned with like the loss and the ruptures of the loss. But just because something changes form doesn't mean that the whole thing has been lost. And this is really what I think is very exciting to think about, and to try to, you know, follow that gossamer string.
Do we have any there are no other questions in the chat, right? No? Okay. So is there anybody like, if anybody else wants to share a comment or ask a question, is now the moment, because we have a few more minutes. And otherwise, we can. It's been really. Oh, here, Deborah Berkowitz.
First of all, it was an extremely interesting lecture. It's an area that I'm not very familiar with. I'm from Ashkenazi background, but it reminds me of the phrase, a still small voice. You can never still that voice. It'll come out 5 generations down. And I think that the Lubavitcher Rebbe knew that, because the Jews in Europe were decimated, but he came here to the country and started up again, and Yiddish is now spoken in many places. Similar, it was almost decimated. So I just feel that we, as Jews, we just go on and on and on and on. And I'm proud of it.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to look at. I mean, I think that I know that there's a recent film, I still haven't seen it yet though. It's called, I think, Songcatcher, and he talks about some of the songs going and recording some songs, some Yiddish songs actually in I think it's in Ukraine, and it's women's songs. And it shows that some of the material in these women's songs actually were connecting to what they were teaching in the Torah. And so this, or they called it the women's Torah or the people's Torah. So there's this issue of, Bedigovsky. Thank you, Judith. Hi, Judith. I think that this is something that hasn't been looked at in that, I would say, hierarchical rabbinical manner, because it's always been kind of pushed aside and said, oh, well, you know, this we're going to look at the, you know, the Hebrew material and the religious material, and then everything else that the Jews did, well, you know, it was secular, so it didn't really matter. But actually, when you're looking at communities that don't have the dichotomy of sacred and secular in the same way that people in the 20th and 21st century think about it, then everything that they did matters. So when they sang Celia Cruz, it matters. And when they sang, you know, the Turkish songs in Makam, it matters. So it tells you something about every single aspect. Or Rebetiko, for example, it has something to do with all the different aspects of their Jewish life within this larger community, which, so in the Eastern European community, it was maybe because of the shtetl and the ghettos, it was a little bit different, but maybe not. Maybe there was actually a lot more seepage than people want to say today. And I would say that that this is part of what being a Jew is this interconnectivity with a very core individual localized manner of distinctiveness, while at the same time being within a larger society and connecting in a variety of different aspects. And so we can't just, when we reduce ourselves only to the religious or the secular, then we're losing a part of our biggest richness, I think.
I just want to mention that I listened to your singing, Serena. So, it's a Ladino song all the time. I love it.
Go ahead, Cassie, if you have a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, that brings to mind when she's talking about, like, the songs and the oral, like, traditions. That brings to mind, recently I've heard many things about the B'nai Israel in India, and they don't necessarily have like the Hebrew literacy to back them up, but a lot of their traditions are through songs and through oral traditions.
Yeah, I believe that there are many communities that have this very strong oral aspect, and there are, and I think that it's the canonization of Hebrew as the language for liturgy wasn't from the very beginning. We know that that in Byzantine Judaism, they were reading the Torah in the synagogues in Greek for a long time, and not in Hebrew. And nobody talks about it today because it's not, the political thing that we do. Like everything is Hebrew, right? But we haven't always been like that. And so I think this is really important for us to know and think about and reflect on, and understand that actually that the transmission of Judaism is more than just the transmission of Hebrew. The transmission of Judaism is the transmission of and so this is like the ultimate question, like what is it then to transmit being a Jew to the next generation? What is it? Is it this multiplicity of elements that can coexist and move forward and interact? Is it learning how to read a parsha and standing up in the synagogue? What is it? This is like, as we say in Spanish, la pregunta del millón. This is the $1 million question. And maybe it's different things for each community or for each family or for each individual. And I don't think that anybody has the right to legalize that for anybody else, right? Because it's and so this is why I think it's so interesting to look at the complexity of expressions of deeply committed Jewish practice. So the Bnei Israel, they're deeply committed, right? But it might not look like that to somebody else who thinks of, you know, performing Judaism in a more restrictive manner. And these are.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. This is really, it was a fascinating lecture and discussion. Thank you very much. We can continue. I have so many things to discuss. We probably would have other opportunity to continue it. And of course, it's going along with the lectures that we had before in the series, and it's very connected to the one that would be the next. So thank you very much, Vanessa. Thank you, everyone that joined us. Thank you, Angie and Sabrina and Anna and Sean, everybody that was working around that. And we'll meet again, and a happy Pesach to people that celebrate.
Yeah.
Ramadan Kareem. Yes, so our last meeting is going to be in May 11th, right? That's the, yeah, so May 11th, yes. Please join us.
With Julia Phillips-Cohen and Avi Meitz. So you're all welcome.
Okay, bye-bye.
Pesach Sameach, and
yeah,
thank you very much, Vanessa. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really been a joy and a pleasure, and looking forward to continuing the conversation in person or online. Yes.
We will find ways.
Great.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.